On a humid August night over the western Pacific, a fully functioning jumbo jet is descending toward a runway ringed with hotel lights and palm trees. The engines are healthy, fuel is sufficient, the navigation radios are working, and air traffic control expects to see landing lights appear out of the rain at any moment. Yet, within minutes, this same Boeing 747 will impact rising ground miles short of the airport, still under control, still responding to every input from its crew. The flight is Korean Air 801 from Seoul's Gimpo Airport to Guam, a familiar route for the airline, flown routinely by crews who know the island as a tropical outpost of tourism and U.S. military activity. On the night of August 6, 1997, the flight is carrying more people than usual, including athletes bound for a regional games event, so the airline has upgraded the aircraft type to a larger Boeing 747-3B5. Outside the cabin windows, broken layers of cloud and showers are drifting over the island. Weather reports describe scattered and broken clouds from roughly 1,600 to 2,500 feet, with overcast higher up and showers in the vicinity, but acceptable visibility for an approach. It is not a typhoon, not a violent storm, just the kind of showery tropical night that pilots handle every day. Somewhere ahead, beyond the rain, the runway is waiting. The airport's instrument landing system can provide lateral guidance to the center line, but a key piece of vertical guidance is officially out of service. Notices and broadcasts on the ground already say so. Yet on the flight deck, a quiet mismatch is forming between what the airport is actually offering and what at least one pilot believes is available. That mismatch, still invisible to everyone on board, will prove far more dangerous than the weather itself. To understand how this happens, it helps to step back and look at the system that is about to be tested. Korean Air 801 is operated by a Boeing 747-300 registration HL7468 configured with multiple cabins and 4 Pratt & Whitney engines. Delivered in the mid-1980s, it is a mature, well-understood design, and on this route it is operating well within its performance envelope. The route from Seoul to Guam is a long overwater leg, crossing time zones and taking the crew deep into the circadian low of the early morning hours. The aircraft departs Seoul at night and is scheduled to arrive in Guam shortly after 1 a.m. local time. By the time the jet begins its descent, the crew has already been on duty for many hours, with the most demanding phase of flight now coinciding with the point of maximum physiological fatigue. The airport at Guam, Antonio B. 1 Pat International, lies near the coast, but the island is not flat. To the southwest of the field rises the high ground around Nimitz Hill and Bijia Peak. The primary instrument approach to runway 6L uses an instrument landing system. However, at the time of the accident, the glide slope, the part of the system that provides precise vertical guidance, has been removed from service. Pilots are notified by a NOTAM and by the Automatic Terminal Information Service that the night's approach is localizer only, a non-precision procedure that relies on step-down altitudes and a minimum descent altitude instead of riding a continuous electronic slope to touchdown. In theory, the difference is clear with no glide slope. The crew must treat this as a staircase descent, leveling at each published altitude until the next step-down fix. In practice, habit and expectation can blur that difference, especially for a captain who is used to seeing a vertical guidance needle come alive when the localizer is captured. One of the central questions the investigation will later ask is why the crew's mental picture of the approach does not fully match the reality that the charts and broadcasts are trying to convey. As the 747 nears Guam, descent planning begins. The first officer and flight engineer manage checklists and radio work while the captain flies. Company procedures call for a structured approach briefing before descent, including the type of approach, the step-down altitudes, the minimum descent altitude, and the missed approach strategy. According to the investigation, this briefing is shorter and less detailed than it should be. It places emphasis on the expectation of a visual finish and good visibility, rather than on the full discipline required for a non-precision approach over high ground. Air traffic control clears the flight to descend toward Guam and later assigns 600 feet as an intermediate altitude, consistent with the published procedure. The crew intercepts the localizer for runway 6L and is then cleared for the approach. The published localizer-only procedure requires the airplane to maintain at least 2,000 feet from a fix called flake to the final approach fix, then 440 feet until passing the Nimitz Vor, and only after that to descend further toward a minimum descent altitude of 560 feet above sea level. These numbers matter because the ground beneath the flight path is not uniform. Around Nimitz Hill, terrain rises toward the approach path, which is why the minimum safe altitude in that segment is 440 feet. A later analysis will show that the chart used by the crew may have displayed an older minimum safe altitude and omitted one of the obstructions near the VOR, adding another layer of confusion to an already complex picture. On the flight deck, descent mode and vertical speed are selected. The aircraft begins down the slope, and the crew starts listening for altitude callouts. Instrument needles move steadily. The localizer appears centered. Behind the scenes, the navigation geometry is slightly more complicated than usual. The distance measuring equipment is paired not with the localizer at the airport, but with the Nimitz VOR further out, so the distance readout corresponds to that station. The procedure requires the crew to cross-check those distances and altitudes carefully. At this stage, nothing looks obviously wrong. The airplane is configured for landing, speed is under control, and the descent angle feels familiar. Yet the stage is now set for a subtle but decisive error. The crew is about to treat the step-down profile as if a continuous glide slope were available, descending below a protected altitude before they are allowed to. The final approach begins in darkness with scattered lights visible through rain and low cloud. The crew expects to break out and see the runway environment, but each time they look ahead, the view remains obscured by showers. The captain continues the descent, apparently believing that electronic guidance is assisting the vertical path even though, officially, no such glide slope is in service that night. Flight data show that as the aircraft passes inbound, it descends through 440 feet earlier than the procedure allows, at a point still some distance from the Nimitz Vor. This is not a minor deviation. That altitude represents the minimum safe altitude for that segment, intended to clear the rising terrain ahead. The crew should level there until crossing the VOR and then descend further toward 560 feet, the published minimum descent altitude. Instead, the descent continues. Altitude callouts are made, but they do not trigger a firm, shared decision. The flight engineer and first officer express unease about the lack of visual contact with the runway and the steepness of the descent. According to the investigation, their interventions are phrased more as observations than as assertive commands to stop the descent or execute a go-around. Ground proximity warnings begin to sound oral cues designed to alert the crew to a dangerous combination of altitude, descent rate, and terrain in a stable, well-rested cockpit. These warnings would typically prompt immediate action, leveling off, adding power, or going around. Here, in the clutter of late-night workload and an expectation that the runway should soon appear, they do not break the momentum of the plan. All the while, radar controllers in Guam are watching symbols on their screens. A minimum safe altitude warning system exists, designed to detect when an aircraft descends below the protected altitude, but in this sector it has been deliberately inhibited because of frequent nuisance alerts. That decision will remove one of the last possible external safety nets. Seconds later, as the aircraft descends through approximately 660 feet near Bijia Peak, about 3 nautical miles short of the runway, it is still under control but now below the terrain ahead. When the hillside finally appears out of the rain, there is almost no time left. The impact that follows is sudden and catastrophic, and post-impact fire consumes much of the airframe. Out of 254 people on board, 228 will not survive, while 26 survive with serious injuries. To understand why a modern airliner could be flown into rising terrain under control, it is necessary to look closely at the systems and procedures involved. This is a textbook case of controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT. An airworthy airplane, with functioning engines and flight controls, is inadvertently flown into the ground because the crew's mental model of their position and altitude no longer matches reality. On a precision ILS approach, the horizontal needle localizer and vertical needle glide slope create an electronic corridor. Pilots can think of it like sliding down the center of a tube, with the indicators telling them to nudge left or right, up or down. On the night of the accident, that tube was only half there. The localizer was working, but the glide slope was officially out of service. In a non-precision, localizer-only approach, vertical control becomes more like walking down a staircase in the dark. Each step is a published altitude associated with a geographical fix, and pilots must not leave a step until they are certain they have reached the correct point. On the Guam 6L procedure, that staircase includes 2,000 feet between flake and the final approach fix, one 440 feet until crossing the Nimitz Vor, then a descent to 560 feet, the minimum descent altitude, maintained until the missed approach point. The minimum descent altitude is the lowest altitude to which the aircraft may descend without the runway environment in sight. It functions like a hard floor the crew may level there and continue inbound, but they must not go lower unless they positively identify the runway and can continue visually. A glide slope, if available, allows a smooth descent through that floor in controlled visual conditions. Without it, descending below MDA in darkness over uneven terrain is precisely what the rules are meant to prevent. Another complication in Guam is that distance measuring equipment for the approach is paired with the Nimitz Vor, not with the localizer at the runway threshold. This means that crews must carefully translate those distances into where they are on the path relative to the airport. In combination with fatigue and a belief that vertical guidance might still be available, this can make the mental geometry of the approach more fragile than it appears on paper. Finally, there is the ground-based safety net, the minimum safe altitude warning system in the approach control radar. In principle, this system compares the airplane's altitude with the local terrain and triggers an alert if the aircraft descends below safe thresholds. In Guam, that system had been intentionally inhibited for certain areas near the airport because controllers were receiving what they considered nuisance warnings. The investigation would later show that, had it been fully active, it might have generated a low-altitude alert roughly a minute before impact, enough time, in theory, for a warning to reach the tower and then the crew. Taken together, these elements form a layered defense procedure design, minima discipline, cockpit instrumentation, and external monitoring. On the night of Korean Air 801, those layers were present, but they were not all being used to their full potential. Behind the instrument readings and procedure charts are human beings, operating under real constraints. The captain of Flight 801 is experienced, with thousands of hours on type, but he has also been on duty for an extended period and is approaching the most demanding part of the flight at a time when the human body is naturally at its lowest alertness. Fatigue is not a visible instrument indication, but it affects how quickly patterns are recognized, how strongly doubts are voiced, and how readily a crew abandons a plan that no longer fits the situation. In the cockpit, roles are clearly defined. The captain flies, the first officer assists with navigation and radios, and the flight engineer monitors systems and performance. Korean Air's procedures call for a thorough approach briefing that should include explicit confirmation that the glide slope is out of service, a clear emphasis on the non-precision nature of the approach, and a reminder that descending below minimum descent altitude is not permitted without the runway environment in sight. According to the NTSB, the actual briefing falls short of that standard, leaning toward a mental picture of a mostly visual approach in acceptable weather. As the descent continues, indications arise that the plan is not unfolding as expected. The runway remains unseen. Descent rates increase. Ground proximity alerts sound. The flight engineer questions whether the vertical guidance being followed is really the correct signal. The first officer comments on the steepness of the descent and the lack of visual contact. But these cues do not coalesce into a decisive intervention. Instead, they remain as scattered concerns, softened by deference to the captain's authority and the expectation that normality will soon reassert itself. This pattern is sometimes called plan continuation bias, once a crew commits to a course of action, especially after a long duty day and in the face of schedule pressure or fatigue. They may unconsciously filter information in ways that preserve the plan rather than challenge it. In hierarchical cockpit cultures, where questioning a senior captain is socially difficult, This bias can be reinforced by an authority gradient that makes subordinates reluctant to issue blunt commands like "go around." Communication with air traffic control also plays a role. Phraseology emphasizes assigned altitudes like 600 feet, but does not strongly reinforce the higher terrain-driven minima that the crew must observe once established on the approach. There is no external voice saying, in plain language, that descending below published minimum descent altitude without visual contact is not acceptable. In these conditions, fatigue, a subtly incomplete mental model of the approach, a softened challenge from support crew, and no strong external warning, the cockpit is vulnerable to a sequence in which each small decision seems justifiable, but the total path leads steadily toward terrain. The tragic irony is that, right up until the final seconds, the aircraft remains controllable, power is available, and a go-around would have been physically possible. What is missing is the human decision to break away from the approach. In the months and years following the accident, investigators reconstruct that missing decision space in painstaking detail. The National Transportation Safety Board retrieves flight data and cockpit voice recordings, analyzes radar plots, reviews charts and NOTAMs, and interviews controllers and airline personnel. The resulting report, issued in January 2000 as Aircraft Accident Report NTSB AAR 0001, identifies a chain of causes and contributing factors rather than a single failure. The probable cause centers on the captain's failure to properly brief and execute the non-precision approach and his descent below minimum descent altitude before having the runway environment in sight. The report also cites the first officer's and flight engineer's failure to effectively monitor and cross-check the captain's execution of the approach, noting that their interventions did not reach the level of assertive challenge that the situation required. Contributing to the accident, investigators note, were several systemic issues. One was the captain's fatigue, which likely impaired his performance during the approach. Another was inadequacies in Korean Air's flight crew training and oversight, particularly regarding non-precision approaches and crew resource management. The report highlights that company culture and training did not consistently empower junior crew members to challenge captains when safety margins were eroding. On the infrastructure side, the out-of-service glide slope is clearly documented in NOTAMs and ATIS broadcasts, but the investigation questions whether this information was integrated into the crew's thinking with sufficient emphasis. The mismatch between the DME source and the localizer, and the complexity of the step-down procedure over rising terrain, are also treated as risk factors that demanded greater care. A crucial finding involves the minimum safe altitude warning system. The NTSB concludes that the FAA's intentional inhibition of that system around Guam, due to concerns about nuisance alerts, deprived controllers, and the crew of a last-chance warning. Analysis suggests that a properly configured system could have detected the low altitude roughly a minute before impact, leaving enough time to relay a warning and potentially avert the crash. By the time the investigation closes, the central paradox posed at the beginning is fully explained. A modern, functioning aircraft, with engines and instruments operating normally, was flown into terrain because the combined defenses procedures, training, communication, and technological safeguards were all slightly misaligned at the same time. Out of this misalignment came change. Korean Air, under regulatory and public pressure, embarked on a comprehensive safety overhaul. The airline strengthened its training programs for instrument approaches, shifted more strongly toward modern crew resource management principles, and sought external assistance from international carriers and consultants to reshape its safety culture. In the years that followed, Korean Air's safety record improved markedly, and the Guam accident became a central case study in the company's internal training. Regulators and infrastructure managers also acted. The FAA and local aviation authorities reviewed the configuration and use of minimum safe altitude warning systems, issuing guidance to limit the practice of inhibiting these protections simply to avoid nuisance alerts. The Guam radar system and its alerting parameters were re-evaluated so that controllers would have better tools to detect future altitude deviations early. Globally, the accident fed into a broader movement against CFAT. Training syllabi for airlines around the world began to emphasize that non-precision approaches are not second-class procedures to be flown casually, but operations that demand strict adherence to minima and disciplined use of altitude call-outs and cross-checks. Many operators accelerated the adoption of constant descent final approaches, which reduce the risk of diving toward an MDA and instead keep aircraft on a more stable, managed descent path. Another area of focus was fatigue. Investigators and safety analysts used Flight 801 as one of several cases illustrating how tired crews may skip or compress briefings, accept higher workloads, and cling to an initial plan despite mounting evidence that conditions have changed. This contributed to a growing emphasis on fatigue risk management systems, which attempt to treat crew alertness as a safety-critical resource rather than a purely individual responsibility. For everyday passengers, these changes are largely invisible. They appear only in the way crews brief approaches, in the assertiveness of a first officer questioning a descent, in the quiet chime of an alert that controllers now take seriously instead of silencing. But those details, refined in response to past tragedies, are part of what makes modern commercial flight as safe as it is today. Looking back at Korean Air 801, the story is not one of mysterious mechanical failure or sudden weather catastrophe. It is a story of how small gaps in understanding, communication, and procedure can align during a single late-night approach. A glide slope that is officially out of service but still imagined to be working.
Confirmed.
A non-precision approach flown with the mental habits of a precision one. A minimum descent altitude that is treated more like a suggestion than a hard floor. A crew whose members see pieces of the problem but never knit them into a decisive call to go around. A ground-based warning system that has been intentionally muted. The curiosity gaps that opened earlier now have clear answers. The missing piece of the approach was not a failed instrument, so much as a missing shared understanding that there was no vertical guidance and that minima discipline was non-negotiable. The reason no one arrested the descent at 440 feet or 560 feet was not because they lacked the data, but because their mental model of the situation had drifted away from the published procedure. The reason outside systems did not intervene was that the one designed to do so had been deliberately inhibited.
Is paramount.
Yet the legacy is not only one of loss.
Stand united.
On a hillside near Nimitz Hill, a memorial now stands to those who died. And in classrooms and simulators around the world, their flight is studied in detail. When crews today practice non-precision approaches in darkness and rain, they do so with this accident in mind. When controllers question an aircraft's low altitude and pick up the phone to verify, they are acting in the shadow of Guam. And when airlines reconsider how they manage fatigue and authority gradients, they are, in part, answering the questions that Flight 801 left behind. In that sense, the tragedy has been transformed into a tool for prevention. It reminds the industry that even in an age of advanced automation and precise navigation, the fundamentals clear briefings, respect for minima, robust cross-checking, and the courage to abandon a plan remain the final safeguards against controlled flight into terrain. For viewers, stories like Korean Air 801 are not meant to create fear, but understanding. Knowing how a sequence of routine decisions can drift toward danger helps us appreciate the discipline that crews now bring to every approach and the layers of protection built into the system. If you found this deep dive helpful and want to learn more about how aviation learns from its hardest lessons, you are invited to stay with the channel, explore the other investigations, and share this story with anyone who is curious about how safety is built, one procedure, one training session, and one hard-earned lesson at a time.